You may not know him by the name Howie Eric Gardner, but as you will discover today, there is much more to know about this guest than many people know. He is best known for his theory of multiple intelligences. In some ways, he has been held captive by that success, but has written many more wonderful books that adorn the shelves here behind me and explored many other topics from leadership to creativity. But today, we focus on a memoir of his intellectual work. It is difficult to provide a synthesis of a book about a synthesizer writing about his synthesizing mind, but it is a huge pleasure and honor for us to host on the Innovation Show the synthesizing mind of Howard Earl Gardner. You're very welcome to the show.
Thank you. That's a very flattering and appreciated introduction.
Absolutely, Howard. I want to say this first. There's no way this episode will do justice to the tome of work done by Howard. I have some of those books behind me on the shelves for those who are watching us. I have some on my iPad, but there's some that I couldn't track down. And I want to tell you, I just found out that Howard is about to release an entire library of his work, reprint of those works as well. And maybe at the end, Howard, you'll tell us how to find those. But for those people who won't join us for the full episode, let's ensure they hear your message, which is most important about today's episode, which is the synthesizing mind. And you tell us the motivation to synthesize and indeed the ability to synthesize have to do with one's overarching goals. And the act of synthesizing can draw on various intelligences and combinations of intelligence in various ways. I thought that was a way to tee us up, Howard, but I'd love you to get straight to the punch about the synthesizing mind, and then we'll build today's episode.
When I entered the memoir stage of my life, which happens when you get to your later decades, I realized that even though what I'm best known for is the claim that people have different profiles of intelligence, I realized that that was not particularly illuminating when it came to my own mind. I'm an academic, and most academics have a combination of linguistic and logical mathematical intelligence, and that's not a bad description of my multiple intelligences. I happen to be good with music and bad with spatial capacities, but since I don't do either of those things professionally, it doesn't matter. So I said, well, if I'm writing about the mind, I better say something constructive about my own mind. And I realized much more vividly than I ever had before that what distinguishes my own mind is that it's a synthesizing mind. It's a mind which becomes interested in issues, problems, sometimes for a short period of time, sometimes for decades. And it picks up lots of information in the ways that we usually do, talking to people, reading, having experiences, traveling, and so on. And we might think of it as like a clothing rack or a furniture rack. As stuff comes in, we place it within that configuration in a way that's most useful, that helps with the issue or problem that we're focusing on. We might change it, we might drop it, we might look for something new. But I like to think of it as a supermarket where you know everything is going to be in the market, but where you place it from one visit to another might change if all of a sudden it's Christmas or some new food has become very, very sexy. And ultimately, you come up with an arrangement which makes sense to you. We might call that the preliminary synthesis, but you could be wrong or foolish. So you need to be able to try these syntheses out on other people to make sure you're not deluding yourself or that you've missed important things. And then if, like me, or an academic or a scholar, you let it out into the world, and then you can be sure there are people who find problems with what you said, but occasionally they'll say, my goodness, maybe the notion of IQ and intelligence isn't the end of the story about the mind. Maybe, in fact, we have a number of different intellectual capacities. People differ in their profile, and perhaps that's what allows many of us to do things that we're good at rather than pushing us to do things which our parents might want or our teachers might push us toward. And when I published my memoir called A Synthesizing Mind, it was in 2020, so 4 years ago, I thought I was all done with that mission, but I couldn't have been more wrong. I've been obsessed ever since with the synthesizing mind. Every day I think about it and how it works. I've written dozens of blogs, maybe even 100 blogs. I don't count them, try to make sense of what synthesizing is. And I guess there are a couple of reasons why I continue doing this. One, I am interested in the kind of mind I have. Number two, educators, and I'm an educator, haven't thought much about the synthesizing mind. So we have a long way to go if we want to help young people become better synthesizers. And for those people like me with their strengths, give them a chance to broadcast that strength. And then just recently, and I suspect this is going to come up in this conversation, there are these human inventions called large language instruments like ChatGPT and many other variations. And they appear to do synthesizing very well, sometimes amazingly well. And so the question is, what's our role in a large language instrument world? What happens when ChatGPT gets something wrong? What happens when it gets it righter than any human being can have? So this just enlarges the conversation. So for an inveterate synthesizer like me, I'm saying, well, Howard, you thought you understood it in yourself. You thought you understand it in a human being. So let's see if you can understand it in various large language instruments. And that will not only keep me busy for however much time I had left, but undoubtedly generations of human beings and other entities in the period ahead.
The model that came to mind for me about the synthesizing mind is almost like a bee flying from flower to flower, never settling too long on any one flower. And I say that because many of our audience, Howard, many people who work as entrepreneurs or startup founders, they like to get started with something, to build it, and then to hand it to others to build, because that's not really where their skills lie. And it's one of the things I saw, and I wondered where people who listen to this show, people who work in innovation, who don't really want to be bitten by the vampire of an organization and become institutionalized, are they synthesizers? So that was one thing that came to mind. And then there's a quote that you have in the book, and of course you utterly believe this and have built it. It's by Murray Gell-Mann, the idea that the synthesizing mind is probably the most important skill that we need in the 21st century. So this is to decide, well, if I'm going to fly from flower to flower, which are the ones that have the most pollen or the most to give me in order to get the most out of my time so I don't become bored as well. There's a lot in there, but I just thought you might share some ideas on maybe the entrepreneurial aspect of that, because that was very much from reading your memoir. You liked to be a builder, but not to dwell too long on what you'd built.
Okay, that's an interesting line of thought, which I hadn't really focused on before. I guess my initial reaction is there probably are two quite different kinds of synthesizers. When we talk about people who are involved in startups and who want to launch some kind of an enterprise, we might say that these people are quick synthesizers and they may get bored with what they're doing. They may get bored with a particular idea more than will get bored with being managers. And if they're smart, they turn the management over to somebody else with that strength. But as an academic, I'm less interested in the startup than I am in what it takes to get to the finishing line. The best example for everybody is Charles Darwin, because Charles Darwin went on the Beagle when he was young, and he actually spent 5 years traveling around the world and took copious notes. And then for the rest of his life, 50 years or so, he obsessed about evolution, and he had many questions connected to that. But he always was trying to make sense of how do we have the deck of animals and plants and species that we have. And so I guess we might say the quick synthesizer as opposed to the long run synthesizer. That's what your question brings to me. Probably I'm somewhat in the middle because except for an interest in the human mind, which is so broad that it's not even very helpful, I tend to get interested in stuff for not days or weeks, probably for some years. But then when I do the book, whether it's about intelligence or creativity or leadership or education, the issue recedes in the background. So you can help me with this. Are there people who, let's say, do 2 or 3 startups over the course of a few decades and then probably retire and golf or travel? Or is it mostly either people who just do one or people who spend their life doing it? I don't know.
It's that restlessness to keep building and to keep adding value. Because as you say, a synthesizer, actually create something that's seen as value in the world as well. But one of the analogies I saw with your approach as a synthesizer was you'd more interest in the book than the papers. And for me, what that equates to in an organization, if you're an innovator inside an organization trying to change that organization, you've more interest not in the politics and the dog eat dog nature of an organization, but actually in adding value and actually trying to change the organization in some way. And I definitely saw that in you.
Yeah. Though again, the reason I emphasize the books in my book is because if you're doing any kind of science, including social science, and when I say social science, I'm using very little S's because I don't think it's the same as physics or chemistry. The core of the realm is writing articles, not books. And so um, when my fellow graduate students or young doctorates saw me writing books, they said, why is he doing that? That's never going to get him tenure. He needs to write, a dozen articles in well-received, peer-reviewed journals. And while I wrote articles, and I certainly encourage my students and now my grand students, because there's generations, to write articles, it's not the best form for me. I'm very much involved in music. I already suggested that. And it's the symphony and the concerto, the fairly long work where things are developed and then you return to them at the end and they're more embellished. So that's much more my medium than a song or a single movement kind of thing. And I think people really differ in that. That's another thing we might say what people's time horizon is. And I think that you touched on that yourself with regards to entrepreneurs or business people or managers. If some of them they had the article frame of mind. I'm going to do this startup. I'm going to do this startup. They're going to do this startup. Others, I wrote about Alfred P. Sloan, who was with General Motors for 50 years. He was very happy just running one kind of thing. And then maybe somewhere in between are people who do a couple different startups, or people like Gates or Zuckerberg who have such complex entities that within those entities, there are various kinds of startups. And as you and I haven't mentioned yet, a lot of these things don't work. I've got boxes of books that didn't get finished for reasons that don't please me. But yeah, not every project that you start culminates. And also something we didn't mention, sometimes you think it's pretty good, but the rest of the world ignores it or doesn't like it. And I look at the financial papers and often the startup that was a big success for a year or two and maybe even went public, you read that it's going bankrupt or it's been taken over by some firm that's going to completely redo it. So not every effort to synthesis is going to be a success. And I think you have to be tough-minded there. Maybe that's an interesting difference, Aidan, is that if you write an article and it gets rejected, it's not fun, but it's not that big a deal. If you write a book and you can't get it published, or it gets ignored, or it gets bad reviews, that could be years of wasted effort. Mm. That's sad.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting about your approach, you tell us in the book, in The Synthesizing Mind, about your approach to writing a book is that you don't do a piecemeal. You actually sit down and you try to create the entire symphony, or you have this symphony playing in your head that you want to then go and attack. And I thought, well, a lot of entrepreneurs I've met actually have that. They get impatient about how to get there, and they have this vision of where they want to get to. And that's one of their defining characteristics. But one of the things that I thought was so important, and I jump to now because I don't think you get enough time to talk about it, is the work you did with Bill Damon and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi about good work, because good work is such a valuable lesson that you teach us. And the Good Work Project website is live as well. I'll link to all these type of things. But I wanted to get this in early, Howard, because as you know, a lot of people don't give themselves time to synthesize information. So I'm trying to front load some of these very valuable lessons. And then I want to tell our audience, for those of you who will stick with us, I want to talk then later on about what are the ingredients inside a synthesizing mind? Does someone become it? And we'll discover a little bit about Howard's biography there. But let's talk about Bill and Mihai, because you said this was one of the most exciting and fulfilling experiences of your working career.
I'm glad you asked that. It's now been 30 years to the day that this enterprise began. I became famous because of multiple intelligences, not famous in the sense that, as my kids say, nobody going on the airplane knows who you are, but within my world of education and psychology. But the multiple intelligences work has stopped decades ago, but I'm working on the so-called good work enterprise. We now call it the Good Project. I've been doing it for 30 years. I work on it every single day because, as I might put it, multiple intelligence isn't going to save the world, but good work might. Just a very quick bio. 30 years ago, I spent a year with these two colleagues you mentioned, both psychologists. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi died a few years ago. He was very famous for the notion of flow, which everybody's heard of. It's that mental state where you're so deeply involved in something that you lose track of space and time. It's the space between anxiety and boredom and being in flow. I'm hoping you and I are in reasonable flow, and maybe some of the audience as well. It's a very valuable state. Damon is an expert in moral development. He's recently become extremely well known. You may want to include him in this series if you haven't already, for developing the idea of a sense of purpose. And a sense of purpose, everybody would think that they know what they mean, but it's more complicated than that. Purpose is something that is really important for you to achieve, and you spend a lot of time working on it, but it can't just be for yourself. The sense of purpose has to take into account not only your own goals and aspirations, but effects on other people. And the ideas about good work and good citizenship, which we developed literally 30 years ago, involve three entities. And the vivid image, which I think is one of the visuals I've ever created, is the triple helix. You all know what the double helix is for DNA. The triple helix composed of three E's: excellence, working good citizens, they know their stuff; engagement, you can't do work or citizenship unless you get involved in it, unless you spend real time with it; and the third E, which is what I'm obsessed with, is ethics. You can be excellent and engaged, but you can be doing really bad stuff. So an essential component of good work and good citizenship is ethics. Now, we could have a long seminar on ethics, and I'm happy to talk about it as much as you want. There's a visual for you. I'm colorblind, but I don't think you need colors to see this. That's the triple helix. And ethics means not the golden rule. Everybody knows the golden rule. Everybody knows the 10 Commandments. And of course, we should try to follow those, and some of us do better than others. But good work and good citizenship is what you need in a complex society where the right answer isn't obvious. We know you shouldn't kill. We know you shouldn't lie. We know you shouldn't steal. But what do you do if you're a journalist, say, and you observe a crime that's happening, but you're actually trying to cover this as a journalist? What's the ethical thing that you should do? I'm talking to Aidan. He's got a podcast with me. I say something really stupid and injurious. What should he do about that? It's a great story, but in his role as a moderator, and I'm just using examples that pop in my mind. So if you said to me, Howard, you spent decades on multiple intelligences, you spend decades on good work and good citizenship, what's the takeaway? The takeaway is we should develop and nurture our intelligences, but we need to put them to positive ends. It's not enough to be linguistically intelligent. Both Goethe, the German poet, and Goebbels, the propagandist from Hitler, they have plenty of linguistic intelligence, but they put it to very different kinds of purposes. Both Nelson Mandela and Slobodan Milosevic were very effective individuals in getting into positions of power. Mandela tried to bring a warring country together. Milosevic led the killing of vast numbers of people who were in his religion. If you take away nothing else from this, it's not enough to know and develop your multiple intelligence. You need to mobilize them in positive ways. And of course, the reason I work in this every day is because I know that I'm never going to finish it, but that if enough people worry about these issues, if enough people worry about the goodness of work and the goodness of citizenship, we might save the planet. Otherwise, it's doomed. I've had my life. I've got 4 kids and 5 grandchildren and more students than I could count. I would like the world to be a better place for them. It's hard to read the daily newspaper or watch the cable news without getting depressed. But even though, as I say, I am under no illusion that I can change the news, if enough people work on it, we could. That's the only thing that's ever worked in the past, is enough people combining their efforts to try to turn the needle in a positive direction. You've all heard the sermon, but at a time when either climate change or nuclear weapons, or for that matter, a pandemic could wipe out the planet, these are things we need to take seriously. And in fact, this is, again, something we could touch on. I think education from cradle to grave needs to be rethought, not just because of these planet survival challenges, but also because these large language instruments are going to do better almost everything that human beings can do. And the question is, what's our role?
Absolutely, let's lean into it. And I want to tell our audience, Howard's so humble when I asked him, he's like, what would my work have to do with innovation? I was like, everything. Because for me, the the value of multiple intelligences versus just one measure of IQ. One measure of IQ is a very computer-esque intelligence. And if the world is measured by that and actually rewarded by that financially in many, many cases, you you disregard those people at the ends of the bell curve. And those people at the ends of the bell curve, in a sense of multiple intelligence, are so valuable in this new world with large language models. And I wanted to lean into that big time because that's one of the reasons I think your work is so important. Understanding that there is so much value in synthesizers. Synthesizers, Howard, would not show up in many organizations today because they wouldn't get an interview. I was talking to a couple of executives yesterday, and they were telling me that they're replacing interviews, person to person interviews, with AI that will sift through CVs. And I was thinking to myself, a Howard Gardner would never get a job in that world. I definitely would not because I'd be too much on the end of the bell curve, and my synthesizer type CV would not make any sense in that world. And I'd love maybe if you'd riff on
Sure.
that a
Yeah,
little
let me
bit.
push back on it, because while I don't do like large language instruments myself, I know a lot about them, and all they reflect is what's been fed into them. So if in fact you make available and label lots of stuff as synthesizing, it could very easily pick out who's a good synthesizer and who's not. You're right, though. If all you look of what college you went to and what your, in the United States, what your SAT or GRE score is, then absolutely these people are going to. So, I mean, we had a brilliant visitor last week, somebody who would be well worth um, having on your program. In fact, I thought of her when you were talking earlier, Anthea Roberts. She's a lawyer in Australia. And the reason I thought of her is because while my model of synthesizing is pretty simple, she uses the notion of dragonfly thinking, because dragonflies can have thousands of different lenses picking up stuff. And I think that's a very vivid image. When she made a presentation to my wonderful working group, they said what I think most people, particularly on the left, would say, namely, the information in these instruments is very biased. It's very weird, Western educated and so on. And there's not a lot of stuff from Zambia or from the South Seas. But the answer is not to reject the large instrument. It's to get more information from different cultures and from different linguistic groups and so on. So if I were 40 years younger and wanted to change the hiring process in big firms, I would simply feed lots of examples of good and bad synthesizing into the large language instrument, and you would very quickly tell me who could do that and who couldn't.
Very, very true. And I want to give a shout out because you mentioned Dragonfly Eye Mindset, and it's a friend of the show. He's the chairman of Patagonia, brilliant guy, Charles Kahn, and he has it in his book. He talks about 5 mindsets for the future. I'll send you actually a copy, Howard. You'll love this book. And he talks about this idea of having the dragonfly eye. So he sees an ex McKinsey consultant as well, highly successful businessman. And he talks about this mindset being so, so important.
I know that Mike Csikszentmihalyi, who we were talking about earlier, was a great Patagonia fan, and they may well have worked together.
And you'd love Charles as well, and I definitely I'll send you some of his writing as well. I think you'll love him, and I know you read very, very widely. I wanted to come back to something you mentioned about how you could use your skill, like Goebbels, for example, for propaganda. And one of the things you said was very interesting. So, Cheek sent me high. You can be in flow in a conversation like this, which I definitely get into. But you could also be in flow while cracking a safe, robbing a bank, as you say. But I wanted to point out something. I don't know if you noticed this yourself, but you exemplified being a good worker, if we want to call it that, when you decided not to publish a book that you put a lot of work into. It was the bio of D. Carlton Gadusek. I hope I'm saying that name right.
Yes, that's true. And I alluded to earlier when I said even book writers have got boxes of books that that they haven't published and will never publish. Yeah, that was very hard for me. I was generally fond of Gardner, who may well have been the most brilliant person I'd ever met. He was a Nobel laureate who had spent decades traveling the South Seas, learning about different groups, many of them pre-literate. Um, they worshiped him like a god figure. And he was just fascinating to listen to. I just actually wrote a blog, which hasn't been posted yet, about the intelligence of actors, because Carlton said to me 30, 40 years ago, Howard, don't think actors are stupid. They're very smart. Marilyn Monroe would not have gotten where she was unless she's very smart. So I'll make a note to send you that blog. It hasn't been posted yet. But so Carlton was terrific. And somebody gave him the opportunity to write his biography. And he was very cooperative. And we spent a lot of time together. And I think it was mostly written. But then he got arrested for, for pedophilia. And in fact, he was convicted and sentenced to decades in jail in the United States, though there was a plea bargain, which I think was the right thing. He had to leave the country. That's the kind of thing that doesn't get publicized, but he spent maybe 18 months in jail here and then died forgotten in Norway. Naturally, his biography would have been much better seller since he was a Nobel pedophile. But I just felt that it wouldn't be right, because either I'd have to pretend this wasn't the case, or I'd have to spend a lot of time trying to explain it, and you can't explain those things. I will mention, because it's a public record, it's something I'm very sad about. For years, my research group and I took money from a man named Jeffrey Epstein, and so did almost everybody whom I knew. God, once he was arrested, I said, Jeffrey, I cannot take any money from you. Many people who didn't understand that are now in big trouble. But yeah, I think anyone who lives a long time and is in circles where you get to meet other people, you're going to meet other people who are really very bad. Uh, Carlton was bad in one way, and Jeffrey was bad in many ways, but he was very good in one thing, which was being a psychopath and a sociopath. And the only reason I met him was because people who I respected enormously introduced me to him, and that's how somebody like that works. So I do think I hadn't thought about this before, Aidan, that people like you or me who get in situations where they're very unfortunate, we should share that as a learning experience for younger people, because we all can get fooled. I wouldn't say Carlton fooled me, but he certainly did. And Jeffrey fooled just about everybody. I haven't met anybody who said, "Oh, I knew he was a psychopath," because he was very good at it.
Yeah, and I think when you're a good worker and you're trying to see the good in people, you may have a flicker in your gut that tells you there's something amiss, but you lean into the goodness of people a lot, and that can get you in trouble, as you say as well. Like, there's people I've written about, Henry Ford, for example. There's roots right back to the Nazis, and it's very difficult to with the victors write the history, so it's difficult to actually extrapolate what was real and what's not, and as you found out firsthand as well. But I thought, Howard, maybe I'm very reluctant to do this. I've been holding back on this one
Uh-oh.
because I said to you yesterday when we prepared for the show, is like, I remember going to see Radiohead, the famous band, once, and people all wanted them to play a song that they're very, very famous for, Creep. And it's the last thing they wanted to do. They're like, oh, we're sick of playing that song. We've new albums. We've written loads of new albums. We wrote that album 20, 40, 30 years ago. And frames of mind is one of those things. Multiple intelligence is one of those things for you. But I'm very aware that some people who listen to the show have not heard of you. because I hope it's a different audience. And I hope that I can bring your incredible work to a different audience. And if you wouldn't mind giving us a rendition of multiple intelligence theory, a short version, it can be the radio edit. It doesn't have to be the extended play
Yeah.
version.
I'm actually relieved with this request because I thought you were going to ask me to play the piano. And except for my wife, who's tone deaf, I don't play for other people. But it's a very important spiritual part of my life as I do play music every day. I'm happy to do the MI, the brief version. The word intelligence entered science over a century ago when Alfred Binet, who was a very good psychologist in France, said we can have a short instrument, meaning a test, and we can tell from how kids perform in those tests, whether they're going to have trouble in school. And he invented an IQ test. And if you have a half an hour or an hour, then an IQ test is, it's a pretty good measure of how well you'll do in a certain kind of school. We might say a modern Western school. In the South Seas, where how well you sail is what's important. I don't think the IQ test would be relevant at all. And so in the late 70s, I got generous support from the foundation to try to summarize what we know about human cognition. And I had already been working for a decade with brain damage patients. And this is at a time when what I now call the shattered mind was much less understood. But one of the things we learned in brain damage, the simple, most important thing is where in the brain you have a stroke or a tumor or some other kind of attack, because the brain is highly differentiated. And so I said, if we take what we know about human society seriously, we know about the brain, what we know about psychology, the idea of intelligence, a single test, it just doesn't cut it. And so I spent 5 years with a very good team of researchers, kind of combing the information, traveling a lot, talking to lots of people. And I published a book called Frames of Mind, The Theory of Multiple Intelligences, 41 years ago. If I'd called it The Theory of Multiple Talents, we wouldn't be speaking today, because everybody knows people have different talents. It was the lexical choice to call these intelligences, which made, let's put it this way, it made psychologists furious, but it made the rest of the world interested. And as everybody who's listening to this, watching this will know, the person who made these ideas even more famous was Daniel Goleman, who created the term emotional intelligence, which everybody knows, whether or not they know Goldman's name. But multiple intelligences theory, in a nutshell, says instead of having a single computer here, if it works well, you're good at everything. If it works average, you're average in everything. If it works poorly, you're in trouble. The mind is better described as having a number of semi-autonomous computers. That's a hedge or a fudge, but it's deliberate. And these are not just linguistic and logical, mathematical, which is what the IQ tests, but spatial, musical, bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalist. And there might be a few more. And the basic claim is that all human beings have computers, 7, 8, 9 computers, which compute this kind of information. But the fact that your music computer is good, there's no prediction whatsoever whether your spatial computer is good. In fact, I've been married twice. Both of my wives did not have musical intelligence, but were much more spatial and mechanical than I was. And I think anybody who's listening who thinks about it realizes that the fact that somebody's good or bad in music, somebody doesn't tell you whether they're good and bad in understanding other people. So I basically gave 400-page of evidence for something which people know intuitively. What's fascinating to me, and maybe I'll toss this question to you, is my book, Frames of Mind, which is 40 years old and out of date in many ways, continues to sell enormously. Whereas other books I've written about multiple intelligence, which are much shorter and much more up to date, and other books I've written about other things, don't sell at all. And I don't honestly believe that the people are reading those 400 pages and looking at all the footnotes, hundreds of footnotes. But I guess it has a certain iconic thing, just as you were mentioning that when we bring the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or whatever, Frank Sinatra back on the stage, people want to hear the oldies, even though they don't need to because they memorized them. So Frames of Mind, he gave me my 15 minutes of fame. But just as I blog about synthesizing, I blog about multiple intelligences. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to send you my blog about acting. all sorts of things come up to me, and I run about them. It's my mini syntheses that keeps me out of trouble, I hope.
I'm looking forward to actually sharing a bit about your own story because your own story led to this. And one of the things I wanted to ensure our audience understands is a synthesizer needs to have vast amounts of information in order to get to that synthesis. And you asked the question, so I'll answer it, which is, do do I only have that book? And I would have liked to have covered that book because mainly so everybody would have heard it. But then through doing that, and this is my own probably synthesizing mind, your book helped me understand my own approach to even the show. Is I cannot just read a book and if you mention loads of other people, which you do in your books, I have to buy all their books too. Which I was telling Howard beforehand. I tracked down lots of hardcovers because I love hardcovers on the shelf here behind me, and it was tough to get them. Some of them, some of the older books, for example, uh, Quest for Mind, which is a great book. They were difficult to get physically, but then Howard said there's a new whole series of Howard Gardner, the whole series coming out very very soon as well. Howard, maybe while I'm saying that, when is that coming out
Okay,
so
well,
people
sure.
know?
Happy to plug that. First opportunity to do so. Yeah, Teachers College Press, which is connected to Columbia University in New York, is publishing two volumes. The first one, which will be out in May, is called The Essential Howard Gardner on Education. And the second one, which will be out in the fall, is called The Essential Howard Gardner on Mind. And what I did with lots of help from friends and family was to put together 20 or 30 articles about the mind and 20 or 30 articles about education with introductions and what I call legends, namely, how did I come up with this and where do I agree and disagree with it now? And uh, as I joke, if my kids or grandkids say, tell me about your grandfather, what did he write? If you give them a list of 30 some books and if you forget it, you say, well, actually, if you're interested in the mind, here's a book and you can get his thinking. And in fact, at the end of the very end of the book, I just did this recently within weeks. I talk about if I had more time, what I would do about education, what I would do about the mind. So it's a kind of a look forward as well as a remembrance of things past. And since I've clearly have reached the age and stage where most of my life is behind me, there's both an inclination to put stuff together as best I can, but also to say for people who are interested in this, here's the things that you might look at going forward.
And I always felt that from you that you're a mentor and you're trying to uncover the baton to hand forward as well to help people synthesize what is the baton, what's the valuable baton to be able to carry forward and build upon. And you asked me that question about your book. I wanted to cover that because it is the album, the most well known Howard Gardner album. But through doing that, I went down the rabbit hole, and I think the rabbit hole is way more interesting because it's only by understanding how you got to those ideas and how you built upon them that you can actually develop yourself. But I think the biggest challenge I see, Howard, in the world, and you talk about it a bit in your book, the app generation, is that people don't give themselves the time to synthesize or perhaps don't value it enough, or it's a huge privilege, I have to say, to be able to give the time to read because many people are on the hamster wheel of life and have to earn a crust, etc., etc. I do too, but I try to make time and not at the expense of my family, which is my real cutoff point. But it is a huge sacrifice, and I think our minds, our attention spans are becoming less and less. So people can't even read. So out of all the copies of your books that we read, like most business books, very few are read. They might sit on shelves, which is a huge shame, I think, because when I read your book, I want to read the book that you wrote, and Howard wrote another book about the critiques of multiple intelligences. So a 400-page book about all the critiques that came at you, and you answered each of them. Like that for me is critical thinking.
Well, the only thing I can say that will be useful to this dilemma, which you described, but everybody whose conscience hasn't, is you need to decide what it is that you're not going to do. So, for example, I do not do social media. I've never been on Facebook, Twitter, any of these media, and I have colleagues who sometimes tweet what I've done, but I don't even know about that. So one way I save time is not doing social media. And you know that nowadays, young people in particular can spend more time on social media than they do in school. Obviously, it doesn't give them time for anything else. Another thing I do is I cut out certain activities. I don't travel anymore, and I could travel. It's not partly my age, but I don't travel anymore. And I also read very little fiction, though I used to read, you know, novels people were talking about. I also read things very quickly and then go back and reread them if I feel I need to go further into them. My wife is wonderful, and she does so many things which I wish I could do, but I can't. But I do one great favor for her. I read lots of newspapers and magazines, and I circle the ones, I email her the ones that she should read because I know what she's interested in. But you have to be willing to discipline yourself. But what I won't give up is walking, exercising, playing the piano, and spending time with my family. So what I'm saying is obvious. I'm sure the Greeks said the same thing, but uh, it means you have to be prepared when somebody talks about the most recent movie, you haven't seen it. And if you're interested in Barbie or Oppenheimer, you can read about it and then you can decide whether or not you want to do it. But it's a question of disciplining yourself. Also, as I get older, I might take many more notes. When I was young, the brain took the notes, but now I take notes and it helps me, and that ultimately saves time because otherwise I could go back and reread things or look at the movie a second time. So, like Ellen and I watched the first episode of a new thing I think we just started this week called Ripley. It's a when I went out and I had a theory about it. I went and read about it, and I said, look, I don't have to watch the rest of this. What's really good is the cinematography. I know the story, so it's disciplining yourself severely and deciding what's important. And of course, when kids are 13 or 14, they don't know enough to do it themselves. In the United States now, everybody's talking about Jonathan Haidt's new book about how we should ban kids having any social media until they're teenagers, and it's gotten a lot of play because people who are older realize that you don't want to waste your youth on circulating photographs of yourself naked. It's not a good use of time. But you can't expect kids to know that.
Oh, it's
Having
brilliant. I'm delighted, man. I'm delighted to have time with you. I often think about what you said there, that in life, in order to get more done, you have to be more like a sculptor than a painter. So it's what you take away, to your point, that I remove pieces in order to be able to create. So I needed to be a sculptor first in order to be a painter and add to a blank canvas. And that's the key, in particular with such a busy world. There's more to your intelligence than IQ tests. And that's one of the huge things I take. And I tell people about you for that reason all the time, because maybe their children are not excelling in school, but that doesn't mean that they're going to fail in life. You need to nurture them in other ways and maybe their interests, etc. That for me is such an important thing. But I wanted to point out one thing, Howard, because I'm just conscious of our time. One of the things you say about MI theory, multiple intelligence theory, is that you can summarize it in a sentence. And as Howard writes, this guy Gardner claims that we have 7 separate intelligence called the multiple intelligences. But you say then, of course, that's also a bad thing about the theory. It's easy to draw many erroneous conclusions from a single sentence summary of a massive tome. And you tell us later that sometimes others have deployed or refashioned your ideas in destructive ways, and this has in fact led you to redirect your own energies. And I thought that was important to cover because it's out there and it's something that you stopped spending energy on trying to stamp out, but others had used it. This is almost like the idea of flow, etc., being used in the wrong way, or as you say, Google's skill being able to be able to use propaganda in a negative sense. Maybe we'll say a quick word on that, but I thought that was important, Howard.
Yeah, the conversations I had with myself was number one, should I commoditize this in any way? And my kids always say, we'd be really rich if you were to have MI curriculum and MI tests and MI games and so on. But I decided not to. Even as recently as yesterday, Shinri and I, my colleague, decided we weren't going to post a blog because it seemed to be promoting a particular product, and we decided we shouldn't do that. So I'm a strict constructionist, in that sense, and people can reach different decisions. But once you try to commoditize and once you try to monetize, you become, in a sense, a slave of that. And so, while lots of uses that are done of my ideas, I don't like them, but they're innocuous. I don't say anything about them. But I'll mention two examples. One is in Southeast Asia, particularly India, there's a whole industry of doing fingerprint analysis and telling what intelligence you have. It's called glyphics. And yeah, I say this is complete nonsense and you should pay no attention to it. Also, I write about this in A Synthesizing Mind. Back in the 90s, there was an entire state in Australia which took MI theory and listed all of the racial and ethnic groups and which ones the intelligences they had and which ones they lacked. I said, this is nonsense. And I actually went on television, the Sunday program there, and denounced it. And that's not an easy thing for someone like me to do. I'm not a media person, but if you see stuff that's really irresponsible, I think you need to speak up. And contrary-wise, if you see things that's nonsense, you need to indicate it. But on the other hand, once you start to monetize it, then you become a slave, essentially, of is the product still going to sell? Well, you can say, well, Howard, you do give speeches and you do write books. And I say, yes. And I try to do that in a responsible way. And there's certain books I certainly wouldn't write, like the biography of Gardner. And there's certain places I wouldn't speak. I face a difficult dilemma, as almost any academic, almost any public person does, when you get invited to speak in China, in Iran. I spoke in Russian 1 week before the this is by video, before the invasion of Ukraine, and we were already talking about that. And this is a real dilemma because you don't want to be seen as proving what's going on in that country, and there's lots of stuff going on in the U.S. I don't approve of, and lots of stuff going on in the U.K. Ireland, I think, just got a new prime minister, right, in the last 36 hours or so. When do you speak up and what do you say and when are you quiet? And there's no perfect answer, but if anybody's interested in a good project, we have an entire curriculum, 15 different lessons about how to help develop good work and good citizenship in young kids. And I'd much rather be known 50 years from now when I'm dead for the stuff on good work than stuff on multiple intelligences, because the world's not going to be saved by people that are smarter. It's going to be people who use their intelligences, as I said, for benign ends, which doesn't mean we always get it right, but we try hard to get it right. And when we get it wrong, we admit it.
I see those things as connected, Howard, that multiple intelligences empowers people with multiple intelligences. If they know that this is valued, that's an important thing. And then often it's those people who have those different types of intelligences that are the people who lean into truth, beauty, and goodness. And I use those three words for a very important reason because it's linked to good work. You have those dilemmas about should I give a talk in Russia? Should I publish that book? Because you know your values very well and you've decided that they are your values. Very few people actually take the time to do that. I think it's such an important thing to do. And I say all that to say one of the books that remains closest to your heart, you tell us, is Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed, Educating for the Virtues in the 21st Century. And there's a subtitle of the paperback that is far more evocative. And it says, Education for the Virtues in the Era of Truthiness and Twitter. I thought that was an important book to mention for you because it's so close to your heart.
Yeah, sure. And I'd be very happy to talk about that. I'm not asked about it very often. But let me just say, I wrestle with the kinds of moral dilemmas that you mentioned, but it's very stupid to wrestle with these alone. I have wonderful colleagues, wonderful family, and yet even at the cost of boring my kids and grandkids, we always talk about ethical issues and what we should do, and it gets into their bloodstream, and I hope into their brain matter as well. And when I turned 80, I gave each of my grandchildren what I call an ethical will, which is the values which I have. And it doesn't mean that I always fulfill them, but I wanted them to know what was important. But I realized that in my own work, I'd always been wrestling with these issues. I began as a researcher in the arts, that's beauty, and then trying to understand children developed cognition that's about truth. And then goodness, as we've talked about, was something that when I saw how my own thoughts and ideas were misused, I realized that if there wasn't a moral and ethical component, that it was worthless. So I decided to revisit these three classical virtues, these three virtues that go back to Greek and Roman times. And I realized that in some cultures, Confucian cultures in particular, truth, beauty, and goodness is soon to be one thing. It's an amalgam. You can't have one without the other. As somebody from the West, that doesn't make sense to me. You can be very beautiful and filled with lies and so on. These are three separate virtues, but I think they need to be revisited frequently. And that was the reason for the subtitle. When I was young, and maybe when your parents were young, there was one newspaper and one television show, and that sort of defined what truth was.
You're being generous to me there, Howard. I had 2 TV stations and several newspapers. I'm older than that.
I mean, the BBC, though, that was it. There was no Channel 4 and no Murdoch sort of stuff. But now it's very difficult to figure out what's true. And we've talked a lot about what's good. That's not something anybody can decide for themselves. And beauty is an individual decision, but any person who's developed would change their notion of what's beautiful. And they should. I always use the analogy of food. Every 5-year-old loves McDonald's, wherever they are, and hamburgers and thick shakes and so on. And that's fine. But it'd be a shame if you went through life only eating what you thought was good at age 5. To discover different kinds of cuisine, to stretch yourself as part of growing and developing. So simply, I don't know that I reject what I like as a kid in reading and music and so on, but certainly it's expanded a lot. So in this book, I really wrestle with traditional philosophical questions, namely, how do we think about truth nowadays? How do we think about beauty? And how do we think about goodness? And I lay out my best synthesis. And the book has been out for a decade or so. And I bet you that in the area of all three of those areas, truth, beauty, and goodness, the arrival of large language instruments makes it much more complicated, as we were talking about. I mean, beauty, if something was made by a machine, do I think about it the same way as it was made by my grandmother, or my grandchild? Similarly, truth, if we now have syntheses done by computers, thousands and thousands of different articles, are those better than what Darwin did when he went on the Beagle? So I think that we need to continually revisit these issues. And even though the book was basically ignored by the general public, which is its right, philosophers actually took it seriously. And I think that's one bit of advice to anybody who's in the chattering classes is one thing is how popular stuff gets, and you can't control that. But the other thing is, does it come to the attention of serious people, and can they give you good feedback? And especially if you've had lucky enough to have had some success in the more general public world, to have colleagues who can give you honest criticism is really very, very important. I I have many, many bad features. You could spend several programs on that. But any email I get, which is not just frivolous, I try to answer. And that's my effort to be a good citizen of the global stratosphere. Is not an issue which any of my teachers would have had to deal with. Ezra Klein, you may know, he's a pundit, very good one for the New York Times. He just closed his Google account because he said he had over 1 million unanswered things. And talk about using your time wisely, it's not using your time. So just this past week with my assistants, we talked about how to separate those inquiries where if we simply say, you should spend a few minutes in Google. We'll try this out with a large language instrument. And if you still have questions, come back to me to separate people who are just, if you say, someone says, well, Gardner, tell me what multiple intelligence theory is. I'm not going to spend my time doing that unless it's you.
No, I am so aware of that and so grateful because I suppose I wanted to try and expand it and share with you how it reflects into my world or my sphere of innovation and ultimately changing minds because mind is the human mind, the synthesis of the human mind is at the heart of your entire oeuvre of work over the decades. And that for me is actually what innovation is about. You can have the best idea in the world, but if people don't use it or don't buy it or don't implement it, it's going to sit on a shelf and die somewhere. But there's other stuff that you talk about, Howard. It's like, in order to have an innovative society that's able to deal with big, thorny challenges, you have to have different thinkers that are able to work together, bringing their multiple intelligences together in order to solve those problems, to see them from different angles, different perspectives. But one of the problems then that you deal with is the education system is built for a different era. And you touch on this in books like The Unschooled Mind and The Disciplined Mind. Maybe at a very high level, we could just mention those two because those two are extremely important as well. And they don't get enough airtime.
Yes, you're taking me down another one of my uh, paths from many years ago. The unschooled mind recognizes that we are not a blank slate when we're born, and we're certainly not a blank slate by the time we get to school, whether it's 3 or 5 or 7. And if we assumed that we were a blank slate, we would be in grave error. We would really need to understand what are the spontaneous notions that every young person comes up with about the world, about other people, about work, and so on. And to the extent that those are right, fine. To the extent that they are incomplete, we try to complete them. But if we don't realize that a lot of them are completely wrong and fallacious, like the world is flat would be the most obvious ones, we have to engage that. We can't assume that just because we tell them, well, that's wrong, they're going to change their mind. Why shouldn't I have looked at the up in the sun last week? After all, I've been doing it for the rest of my life. An unschooled mind would say, sure, I've always looked at the sun. What's the problem? My 4-year-old grandchild was not allowed to put on the glasses, the 8-year-old one was, because parents figured that she would understand that you have to put those glasses on, but the 4-year-olds take them off. So that's actually a very good example of the unschooled mind. The disciplined mind was an homage to, and I think I say this in the very beginning of the book, that the scholarly disciplines are great human inventions. Things like philosophy, history, science, they weren't present in the caves. The Greeks get a lot of credit for start launching them, but so do Confucian societies and Indian societies, both Native American and the Southeast Asia. And to try to think that we can essentially hop over disciplines, that we can ignore what it means to understand, think historically, think scientifically, think mathematically, it's a grievous error, even though my own interest, as we discussed, is more in synthesizing and interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work. But you can't do that unless you have some sense of what it is to think like a biologist, think like an economist, and so on. That said, if I were rewriting those books, all I can do is change the legends, and I've done that in the 2 collections of my book, is to say, when machines can do this better than human beings, uh, we shouldn't just try to duplicate what the machines are doing. We need to understand how they do it, what they can do wrong, how we can change them, but how best to use our time. And I'm still wrestling with this every day, but a good answer for this purpose is the set of questions which my own teacher, Jerome Rutter, who was a great psychologist and educator, posed 60 years ago when he was developing a curriculum, and I was just a kid working with him. What makes human beings human? How did they or we get that way? Do we become more human or more humane? What makes human beings human? How did we get that way? How can we be made more so? Those questions may be 60 years old, but in a large language instrument Anthropocene era, where the world might be destroyed by the things we talked about earlier, these are really important questions to ask. I guess if I were rewriting the world's curriculum, and thank God for the world I'm not, those are the questions that, that I would pose. And I would try to think about how to handle them in a respectful way, how to get people interested in using their minds well, but at the same time, not duplicating what can be done better by technology, and also worrying about the rest of the world, other human beings. That's what good work is. The problem with many of the people who are tech leaders, I'll use Elon Musk because you can't escape him, is they're not not thinking a lot about other people. They're thinking a lot about themselves and people like themselves. If they can get to Mars, it doesn't matter if millions of people can't. And we can't afford to do that. And I'm not picking on Musk particularly. It's just, we were doing a study in, where was it? In India. And we asked who the best people, best known people in the world was. I forget who one was, but Musk was the other. It might have been Donald Trump. I just don't remember. But I guess Musk is one of the best people known in the world. And so he's got a lot of responsibility. And some of the things he does are very responsible. Some of the things he does are very irresponsible. And if you read Walter Isaacson's book, you get a sense that both of those features are very prominent. Bill Gates probably would not have been distinguishable from Elon Musk when they were both 25 years of age. But I think Bill Gates has tried very hard to use his intelligences in a good work way. That doesn't mean he's always right, but he takes his role as statesman more seriously. And we'll get to see about the Sam Altmans of the world.
On your point there, I'm reminded of something I learned mostly from Stan Lee, the great comic creator. He often has this theme throughout his books that with great power comes great responsibility. And that's certainly true for the likes of Elon Musk with that kind of power. And we see time and time again, like Epstein, the abuse of that power as well, which also points back to the idea of good work and getting that into a child's mind early so they understand the value of that, so they actually grow up with that and ethics, etc. I love your idea of the ethical will as well. But let's move to just a couple of things because I we need to start landing the ship. I've taken enough of your massively valuable time. There was a couple of things that I mentioned at the very top of the show, and I meant to do the show the opposite way, which was lead up to all your theories through your biography, some instances in your biography. There was a couple of things because on this episode you mentioned the value of speaking truth to power, and there was a couple of things that I saw in your history that had a dramatic effect on you. One was your early childhood experience with Miss Dyer and your mother speaking up. Maybe you'll share that. And then the other was later on, and we've talked on the show about Stanley Milgram and the famous Milgram obedience experiments, but you were on a very surprising different end of that instance when you were in class with Stanley Milgram. Those two things, I think, are are experiences that go into the ingredients that becomes your specific synthesizing mind, and then they come out in ways in your writing and later on in the good project.
Sure. Well, my parents were refugees from Nazi Germany. They arrived in the United States on the night of shattered glass. Some of their relatives were killed then. And so they were very careful and protective of me and fearful in general, as immigrants would be. But when I was in sixth grade, I had a teacher who was very powerful and quite mean. And when she and I disagreed about something, the teacher just came in with a paddle and slapped my hand hard. And it wasn't that I was in mortal danger, but I went home and told my mother, and she marched right off to the school and went to see the head of school, the principal, Mr. Reese, Archibald Reese. I remember him. And she said what happened. And the teacher had to come in and apologize to me. And she didn't have to because her brother was a superintendent of schools. But it was a sign to me that sometimes you need to speak up, and even if it takes, even if it takes risks. Yeah, the other episode, I got over it fine, but it influenced how I thought about education afterwards. When I was a beginning doctoral student, I took a course with Stanley Milgram, the authoritarian personality student of how people will administer even life-threatening shocks to a confederate of the researcher, so long as they're told they have to do it. So it's basically a bit of totalitarianism in the laboratory. But anyway, he decided, for whatever reason, I still don't know to this day, to just humiliate me publicly and just attack me in a very mean way. And that didn't surprise me as much as the fact that nobody in the class, including the other teacher, said anything. So I was just made into a whipping boy for whatever reason. And as I say, Milgram died quite young, and we had a civil relationship thereafter why he did that. But having been abused and nobody coming to the rescue, no, my mother, so to speak, that's influenced a lot of how I deal deal with. And sometimes I think maybe I do and say the right thing, which I wouldn't have if those experiences hadn't happened.
And what's interesting there is you say that the other professors that were in the audience came up to you afterwards, so they were fearful of speaking truth to power in the moment itself. I thought that was particularly interesting. Last one was I'm trying to do my best to synthesize my tons of notes that I have here. Is I was thinking about this, that in football, in soccer, the game soccer, there's a term called touch time, and they use it to measure how a child will do. For example, a kid in Brazil, for example, usually a kid born in poverty has a huge amount of touch time. It's the amount of hours they spend a week with the ball. And if you compare that to a wealthy kid from the UK, Ireland, Spain, etc., the touch time in a poverty stricken area like Brazil is much higher. And I thought about that, and I went, well, that's Howard had a huge amount of touch time with information, with synthesizing, whether it was music, whether it was later on in the school magazine, the Opinator, where you even wrote back then about some topics that you further developed later in life. And I say that to say for our audience as well that one of the things I take from your work massively, and I'd love you to maybe extrapolate, is that you have to have, firstly, morals and goodness within you, follow that idea of good work, but then you have to be consistently outputting information and not worrying about all the time how it's going to be judged. Yes, take critique, etc., but sometimes, like your bio that you wrote, it won't go and it won't be publicized, but there's always assets in the ashes. There's always some value from that work that can be later used and can be built upon later on. I think that's something that a child, even in school, should understand, because yes, things aren't going to work out the way you planned, but the effort will. It will, especially if it's done in a systematic way.
I think that's well said. And I don't think people learn this from being told it. I think they learn it from the kinds of experiences that you and I just talked about. I think where parents and teachers and elders or peers can be helpful is in articulating what it is that happened in that particular situation. So it's labeled and more easily uh, accessible. And I don't remember what happened when I was in Miss Dyer's class 70 years ago, but I certainly have spent a lot of time with students and colleagues thinking about this incident with Milgram. So it is very much part of my mental landscape, so to speak. And even though I'm not religious and I don't um, deliver homilies, um, I find myself both with family and friends and students moving rather quickly to things which I think have that kind of lesson component in it, lesson, is what can we take out of this thing, this experience, which might be helpful to us and to others. And I guess that's part of what the teaching does. There's a famous quotation from Henry Adams, which would be a good thing for us to end with, and that is, "The teacher affects eternity. He or she never knows when the influence will end." And I guess that I am fundamentally a teacher as much as a synthesizer, and I am hoping to spread what I think is worthwhile and to, in a nice way, point my finger at things which should be ignored or forgotten.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I had so much more to talk to you about. You talk about leadership, you talk about Project Zeros in there, and I just highly recommend the book to get a full synthesis of that, including I listened to the audiobook, I have the Kindle and I have the hard copy, and all this body of work behind me as well. There was one quote I loved, and I wanted to close on from you. May the human conversation better the human conversations also continue, and may the synthesizing minds thrive. I thought I'd finish with that. And in the name of Verum Pulchrum Bonum, truth, beauty, and goodness, mentor, fragmentor, and master synthesizer of knowledge about human beings and the human mind, Howard Gardner, thank you for joining us.
You're very kind, and I think that you certainly represent and epitomize those virtues as well.
Thank you so
Okay.
much. Howard, amazing.